this episode. On January 20th, President Donald Trump signed an executive order called Designating Cartels and Other Organizations as Foreign Terrorist Organizations and Specially Designated Global Terrorists. The order says that international cartels represent a national security threat beyond that posed by traditional organized crime, with activities that include a convergence between themselves and a range of extra-hemispheric actors, that's a mouthful, from designated foreign terror organizations to antagonistic foreign governments. They have complex adaptive systems, characteristic of entities engaged in insurgency and asymmetric warfare, and they're accused of infiltration into foreign governments across the Western Hemisphere. The executive order declares that the policy of the United States is now to ensure the total elimination of these organizations' presence in the United States and their ability to threaten the territory, safety, and security of the United States. President Trump has ordered the Secretary of State, along with the Treasury Secretary, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Homeland Security, and the Director of National Intelligence to make recommendations and operational preparations to be ready to carry out any orders that the President may make related to this new policy. Now, the new executive order comes amid a widespread crackdown on illegal immigration by the Trump administration, which was, of course, a core part of his campaign. The issue of the cartels and illegal immigration also sit within a broader and much more complex backdrop of geopolitical issues, including trade between the U.S. and Mexico, the fentanyl crisis, which relies on chemicals from China, an increased Russian diplomatic presence in Mexico, and the alleged influence of the cartels into many areas of the Mexican government. Experts and analysts are already trying to predict how the new U.S. executive order will impact the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, and what actions the United States may take against the cartels following their designation as a foreign terrorist organization. In this episode of the State Secrets podcast, I speak with former DEA Chief of International Operations, Mike Vigil. Mike is one of the most highly decorated agents within the DEA and was responsible for numerous multinational operations, the largest involving 36 countries. He's written numerous books and is a widely sought-after media source on all things related to cartels and the U.S. Mexico relationship. Here's my conversation with Mike Vigil. Cipher Brief expert Mike Vigil, welcome to the Cipher Brief studio. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
We always love talking with you, and wow, what a week it's been, and it's not even over yet. But so many things have happened this week that we couldn't let this week go without reaching out to you. There's a lot to talk about.
Well, thank you. There is a lot to talk about.
I want to jump in, Mike, because one of the many executive orders that have been signed this week has to do with a topic that you know a lot about. In particular, that it appears that the United States is going to designate the Mexican cartels as terrorist organizations. I want to start with that by asking you, what's your initial reaction to that designation, and what could it mean in terms of a difference between how we're treating the cartels?
Well, the effort by Donald Trump and his people that are now working with him are going to be part of his cabinet, are trying to designate the drug cartels in Mexico as terrorist organizations. It's not going to have an impact. It's very much political theater, because with the Terrorist Designation Act, it does three things. Number one, it allows the United States to identify and seize bank accounts and properties owned by these designated groups. We're already doing that. Number two, it sanctions U.S. citizens that support or have linkage with enterprises belonging to these designated groups. And then thirdly, it tries to stop them from entering the country. However, no major drug lord from Mexico or any place else is going to want to come into the United States. We're already doing a lot of that through the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. So this is a political theater. simply because there's a lot of people in this country that believe that this designation will allow U.S. Military strikes in Mexico, and bombardments and things of that nature. Nothing of the sort. And as I indicated, we've been doing all of this, for many, many decades, even when I was still with DEA.
Do you, it's already been called, I've heard this sort of phrase thrown around a little bit about the incoming, the new Trump administration, that it's going to be, a disruption administration. We've been seeing a lot of things, for example, in the financial markets that people are viewing positively. It's going to be considered more pro-growth, more pro-business. Certainly the disruption effect is being brought to the world of national security and certain domestic issues. When we're talking about the U.S. Approach to the cartels, also very close to that is the changing immigration policy. Do you think that any of this disruption, even if it is, as you describe, political theater, or if it's largely designed for public consumption among mass audiences, do you think it's going to have any impact on the cartels in terms of their strategic planning or how they're thinking about their day-to-day operations?
No, not at all. And quite frankly, I think that instead of causing disruption and the political theater, obviously we need to build alliances, not destroy them. Because after all, we're talking about transnational organized crime, and this is criminal actors that operate in multiple countries. So it's imperative that we work together, that we share information, and at the very least, create indictments here in the United States, and then use the extradition treaties that we have worldwide to bring them into the United States. The thing that really concerns me is that Donald Trump keeps talking about designating these cartels as terrorist organizations, sealing the border, and all of these actions that are not going to have any impact. But he never mentions the fact that we need to control the weapons that are flowing from the United States into Mexico. Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, ATF, estimates that there's about 200,000 weapons that enter Mexico from the United States. And I'm talking about military grade weapons, that many of them fall into the hands of the cartels. So the key question here is, why are we arming the people that we're supposed to be fighting? The other thing is that it's never mentioned that they're going to take action in terms of reducing the demand here in the United States, because the designation of the cartels as terrorist organizations is very much one dimension, and it's not going to have an impact. So we need to control the weapons, because in Mexico, there's only one gun store in the entire country, and it's on a military base near Mexico City. On an average, they sell about 6,500 weapons every year, and they're low grade. They're not military grade weapons, shotguns and what have you, to go hunting. And they're very restrictive as to who they sell these weapons to.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. It certainly is a complicated issue, no doubt. I know that the weapons issue has been brought up many times over the last year, and as far as discussion, that's going to be one to watch. One of the things that I thought was interesting about this executive order, also, that I wanted to ask you about, it calls for recommendations within 14 days on how the United States can address some of the threats that it lists, as the most urgent from the cartels. But it also calls for the complete elimination of the cartels operating in the United States of America. Is that even possible, and what would it take?
No, it's not. It really isn't possible. Simply because, let's say you take out organizations here in the United States, they can easily be replaced. But let's put this all into context, because most of the people that bring the drugs across from Mexico are U.S. citizens. Most of the people that distribute the drugs here in the United States are U.S. citizens. And Donald Trump talked about also designating the Mara Salvatrucha, or the MS-13 gang, as a terrorist organization, and then also the Tren de Aragua. Let me talk a little bit about the Tren de Aragua. The Tren de Aragua was actually born, if you will, in the Tocoran prison in the state of Aragua in Venezuela. With a humanitarian crisis that's taking place in Venezuela as a result of the narco dictatorship of Nicolas Maduro, there's many of the population is without drinking water, electricity, medicine, and food, which has led to a humanitarian crisis. And about 7.7 million people have left the country, and there's several members of the Tren de Aragua prison that have departed Venezuela, but they primarily have gone into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. There's some in Central America. A few have come here into the United States, but they're really not a formidable force. Obviously we have to monitor them, but they fit nicely into the narrative of Donald Trump of this so-called invasion of criminals, but that's not the case. And I recall that they were saying that the Tren de Aragua was taking over apartment buildings in the state of Colorado, which was debunked by the state governor of Colorado. So it's nothing more than, again, political theater, but the Tren de Aragua is not a big force here. Now, the other thing I will say, and I think it's a very important to make a comment on this, you notice that Donald Trump does not talk about these white supremacist groups, like the Aryan Brotherhood of Texas, the Aryan Kings, the Aryan Circle, and a lot of these white supremacist gangs that are distributing drugs, much more so than the Tren de Aragua.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Do you see it? It clearly looks, at least from our perspective, from what we've gathered this week, and again, it's very early on, it appears that the United States is going to be taking a much more aggressive approach to everything dealing with the border and immigration and the cartels. Do you see any possible, given everything that we've talked about so far in this conversation, do you see anything changing that we may not be thinking about should the United States take a much more aggressive approach towards the cartels and towards the border?
Well, in terms of the border, I know Donald Trump during his campaign and even now says that, we're invaded by these hordes coming in from Latin America. That's not the case. During the course of the last year, the movement of migrants to our southern border has dropped significantly, very significantly. We're not being invaded. And the other thing is that, he's sending all these troops to the border. Troops have been sent to our southern border, several times, but they're not going to have an impact because they're not allowed to make arrests, under the Quasi Comitatus Act. I know that Donald Trump may, try to invoke another law to permit them to make arrests. But like I said, this is all show. This is all show for his base to make it appear like he's really taking aggressive action. But the terrorist designation, no impact at all. The movement of troops to the southern border, again, it's all political theater. The migrants coming to the southern border have dropped again, as I indicated the past year. Why? Because Joe Biden, passed executive orders to limit the people coming in, and then he worked out an agreement with Lopez Obrador, who was then president of Mexico, and Mexico started stopping a lot of these caravans on the southern border, and that is why we see this tremendous drop in migrants coming to the border.
Yeah, there's been a lot reported about that lately. You mentioned the former Mexican president Obrador. The current president, Claudia Sheinbaum, is considered to be a close ally of the former Mexican president. What do you think? What do you predict in terms of her relationship with President Trump? How is she likely to react to a lot of what's been reported? At least the signaled changes coming from the U.S. administration. How do you see that part playing out?
Well, during she has a morning press conference every single day, very much like Lopez Obrador did, and she meets with many members of the media. And in those press conferences, Claudia Sheinbaum has stated that, we need to work with the United States. We need to work with the U.S. And she looks at this things that Donald Trump is saying he's going to do, the designation, the movement of troops to the border, the so-called renaming of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. And she laughs about it. She laughs about it because she knows it's political theater.
We're pausing our conversation for a brief message. The intersection of technology, defense, space, and intelligence is critical to future U.S. national security. Join the Cypher Brief on June 5th and 6th in Austin, Texas for the NatSec Edge Conference, focused on bringing experts, entrepreneurs, and investors together to address gaps in national security and how to bridge them. Find out how to get an invitation to this invite-only event at natsekedge.com or by dropping an email to edge@thecypherbrief.com. Now back to our conversation with Mike Vigil. Well, let's switch gears a little bit. I want to talk about something that we've talked to you about for years now, and that's the issue of fentanyl coming into Mexico. We've talked to you about that, numerous times. You breaking down, sort of the way the whole process works with the precursor chemicals coming from China. Recent reports would have you to believe that the problem hasn't gotten any better, and in fact may have gotten worse in terms of the cooperation between the cartels and the Chinese government. What can you tell us about that? What are your thoughts on that now? And then how do you see that particular part of this issue perhaps changing under the Trump administration?
Well, the issue is that what we've seen here in the United States is that the traffic of fentanyl has stabilized. It hasn't gone up, and it really hasn't dropped. It may have dropped a little bit, but not by very much. Now, Mexico is starting to take a more aggressive approach, and not the one of abrazos y not balazos, the hugs and not gunshots that Lopez Obrador implemented during his sexennial, or his 6 years in office. Recently, under Claudia Sheinbaum, they had one of the biggest seizure of fentanyl in the history of Mexico, and she's got Omar Harfuch, who was her public safety director when she was the mayor of Mexico City, now at the national level as the public safety officer of the country. So he's working very closely, obviously, with the National Guard, with Sedena, or the Mexican Army, and so they're moving forward. But Donald Trump, is thinks that by intimidating them, that they're going to snap their fingers, and the drug trade is going to terminate in Mexico. The Mexican cartels are very formidable, especially the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, which is under the leadership of Nemesio Ceguera Cervantes, or El Mencho, who is a super violent character, and he's transformed that cartel into virtually a paramilitary group. They cut out, Brad, these metal plates, about 2 inches thick, and they wrap them around trucks, and in essence, convert them into rustic military tanks. They put 50 cals on the top of these vehicles. The cartel members, a lot of them run around with military camouflage uniforms and helmets, and they're extremely well armed. The other one is the Sinaloa cartel, which is right now in conflict as to who's going to control that cartel. In July 25th of this year, the ultimate leader, Mayo Zambada, was captured and kidnapped by one of Chapo Guzman's son and brought to the United States. So now they're in conflict, and it's costing the state of Sinaloa about $1 billion in revenue, because a lot of businesses, at least 1,000 businesses, have shuttered in the capital city of Culiacan. People are not going out on the streets. Kids are not going to school. So that is a major problem at this point in time. But Sinaloa still remains the biggest cartel in the world, and they operate in 6 of the 7 continents. They don't operate in Antarctica because nobody lives there.
Speaking of the cartel's capabilities, Mike, there's also been a lot talked about, just in terms of the intelligence capability of these organizations, the electronic surveillance capability. We've now seen reports of drones that have certainly changed the nature of warfare, or changed the way that wars are being fought in places like Ukraine. Now we're hearing more talk of the drone threat, in our own hemisphere. No doubt that the cartels, would like or already have a strong capability with drones. What do you worry about in terms of an escalation risk? If things were to go from bad to worse, if the United States, despite, all of the warnings against perhaps using military force in the region, let's say we did, or let's say we did something else that sparked an escalation in terms of the conflict risk with the cartels, what would we be likely to see? What worries you most about that risk?
Well, I think that, if the United States did in fact go into Mexico, which would be complete insanity, it would be really, really difficult to identify the cartel members. Yes, there would be a lot of conflict. Yes, there would be a lot of a loss of decent citizens that would be caught up in the crossfire. But it would have very little impact, because at the very most, the U.S. military would basically just push the cartels further south, and it would create so much instability. And this would be an act of war, because obviously Mexico is a sovereign nation. And what I would see is a lot of Latin American countries that would come to the aid of Mexico. And instead of looking at the United States as an ally and a large trading partner, what we would see is a lot of these countries then inviting, virtual enemies of this country, like the Chinese, to go in there, and they would start trading with them. They would start allowing, Chinese military to come into their countries, and we would create, and I'm putting it very mildly here, would be a total disaster politically, economically, and militarily.
Would you also add to that a risk of increased cartel activity in the United States of America in the form of asymmetric attacks or threats using criminal groups? Would you expect to see that as an
That could be, and the thing is, Brad, you bring up a very good point, because you can have all the military along the border, but as you well know, and you and I and Suzanne have talked about this, is the number of tunnels that exist along the border, and then as you mentioned, the drones that they use in making attacks. They could fly drones across the border very easily, and then let's not forget that we have common border on the Pacific, and then also on the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah. Final question. The new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, is reportedly planning his first trip to Central America. I believe the first stop would be to Panama, but perhaps there's going to be other areas. But I think it shows the relative importance with which the new administration is putting on the region. If you were advising, the new Secretary of State, what would be some of the things that you would offer to Marco Rubio before that first trip, and how he should be thinking about the region?
But he should be looking at the region is creating alliances, and these alliances would allow the United States to do a better job in combating, the drug movement, coming from South America. You have Honduras, that Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was recently sentenced to 45 years here in the United States. He created a narco state there, and then now they're finding coca plants and coca laboratories. So it's gone from a transshipment point to a country of drug production. But he needs to go in there, and what I would encourage him to do is create a committee of a lot of these countries, if not with the presidents, but at least with the ministers of security for those countries, to talk about these concerns regarding the movement of drugs, the political corruption, which needs to be addressed. But we need to find a way to work together in terms of combating these groups. The other thing that I don't see a lot of mention, there was a threat of tariffs against Canada, but there's also drugs coming in from Canada. There's we have probably a border area there that's twice the size of the 2,000-mile U.S. Mexico border. And then within a 2-year time frame, I think it was from 2020 to 2024, our officials at the border stopped, I believe it was about 500 individuals that were on the terrorist watch list. But Trump's focus is only on the southern border and not on the northern border.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a very good point to remember. You can't forget the northern border. It is vast, as you say. Mike, this has been great. This is, as we mentioned off the top, this has been a very interesting week in terms of news. There is a lot of attention right now on Mexico, on the cartels, on the immigration issue. And we deeply appreciate talking to you and learning from your perspective. And as always, we come away from these conversations realizing that it's a lot more complicated than the headlines do justice to this situation. So we really appreciate your time.
Well, I appreciate the cipher brief simply because you bring public awareness, and that is one of the critical factors in terms of combating drugs. Making sure that we have a focus on security, but that it is a focus on security and not, political theater.
Retired senior DEA officer, Mike Vigil. It's been great to talk with you, and we'll no doubt be talking to you again very soon.
It's my privilege, and always the Cipher Brief does a great job, and I compliment you and Suzanne.
Thanks, Mike. That was my conversation with former DEA Chief of International Operations, Mike Vigil. I'm Cipher Brief COO Brad Christian. Join us back here next week for another episode of the State Secrets Podcast.